Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Richard Lui's debut book, Enough About Me, The Unexpected Power of Selflessness, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Giles. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Richard, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Richard Lui for the launch of his debut book, Enough About Me. Richard Lui is a veteran and award-winning journalist with more than 30 years in television, film, technology, and business. Currently at MSNBC and previously at CNN Worldwide, he's the first Asian American man to anchor a daily national cable news program and a Team Emmy and the Peabody winner. He has just completed an Oscars-qualifying documentary on senior caregivers and military families that will hit national broadcast and mainstream streaming in late spring 2021. In addition, Richard's 15-year business career involves the fintech patent and launching 6 tech brands over 3 business cycles. Richard has lived, worked, and volunteered on every continent. Joining Richard in conversation is Nancy Giles. Nancy is an Emmy Award-winning contributor to CBS News Sunday Morning and host of the Giles Files podcast on iTunes. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nancy and Richard to the stage.
Okay, I have to just start by saying, listening to your bio, I'm doing the math and I'm looking at you going, huh? Like, number one, are I can't figure out by all of the work, like your age. It's a mystery. No, we don't even have to go there. They say black don't crack. I think that extends to many people of color.
Asian don't raisin.
Asian don't raisin.
Brown don't frown.
Brown don't frown. See, I'm learning something.
Yep.
And then on top of everything, I just listened to your credits again, and I'm wondering, how did you manage to find the time and the focus to come up with this beautiful book? Enough About Me, The Unexpected Power of Selflessness. How did you do it?
Yeah, first of all, Nancy, I always love talking with you over the years, and so thank you that we get to sit down and
this is fun
in this great place of books.
I know,
and I know that we all wanted to run up and down the aisles here and just pull books down.
It's true. I know. I feel like as soon as we're done, I'm going to do a little shopping spree, a quiet self-shopping spree here at the Strand.
And the fact that this is the first, if you will, people in the Strand doing a book event like this. So
COVID.
Thank you, Sabir. Thank you, the Strand, for doing this.
It's an honor.
It's great to feel like we're getting better.
That's right.
I hope we're getting better.
Yeah.
And you asked, like, how was I able to do it? It really just came down to, we were all sitting by our windows for about a year. And so I sat by my window and was just tapping away. I started in March. And we actually compressed the timeline because I really felt that we were living through a tough time. And you and I, being in the news business, right, we see it. We see George Floyd and a racial pandemic flare up. This is obviously something the country's been living through for many hundreds of years. But in our time, right, this is one of those flare-ups that we will remember.
That's right.
And that showed an element of a selfish pandemic, people not looking outside themselves. We see the Asian hate crimes today.
Absolutely. That just occurred last week on top of what had been going on before that.
There's a problem, right? There's a problem. And then we look at the mass shootings again this week.
Again.
And
you know what's interesting?
Yeah.
The talk has been that there were 2 mass shootings within the last week, and it's actually more like 100.
That's right.
And something, because technically what's considered
Right.
a mass shooting is any event where 4 people are killed, which is so hard to even say and articulate and realize that that's this country right now.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
And that tells you, because that's the epitome of selfishness, are these people that think their view is so much better or so much more preeminent that, I can take somebody else's life.
Exactly. Wow.
And that, after sitting there, because we had a lot of time to stare out the window. And I just stared out the window and, talking with fellow journalists like yourself and thinking about these things going, we got a problem, because I've been on air way too much, 4 or 5 hours straight talking about these things, trying to figure out who these people are. And so that's why I figured we got to do something small. And the book is really kind of a small antidote to fight the selfish pandemic.
Talk about that selfish pandemic. And is it something that you think has really exacerbated because of COVID, because of, I think, the psychological toll that this pandemic has taken on people? Is that part of what's going on?
I think that, so that's kind of above my pay grade, but I do believe that you're right. That other layer on top has shown the gaps and the wrinkles and the cracks and everything else, right? In every part of every society around the world, all of a sudden the things that may have had a nice wrapper around it, that wrapper fell away when we all had to stay at home.
Right. That's not to say that racism and selfishness hasn't always existed.
Right.
It has.
Exactly.
But yeah, that sort of really showed the seams.
Exactly. And on the flip side, because, it's not all downer. Like it's an amazing, what I have found amazing is that these breaking stories, there are always these selfless heroes. And one of those groups are the healthcare workers.
Mm-hmm.
One of those groups are those who are in the food service industry. April 9th, I believe, last year, half the world was asked to stay at home. Never in our great history, long history, has half the world been asked to stay home.
So weird.
Weird, right?
Yeah.
And because humans are social beings. We don't like to be at home. And if it weren't for all the selfless people that were taking care of the sickness, that were giving us food, that were making sure the lights were on, that the water was still coming through the faucet around the world, those who did have running water, right? That is, to me, it's not all the negative. In fact, we've seen some amazing selfless people.
Mm-hmm.
And that inspired the book to say, and there's stories in there about people that I've reported on, that I've met in the field, that are really inspirational.
Well, what's interesting is you broke it down, and this pandemic really did shed a different light on what first responders means. We think of people like the police and the fire department and EMT workers when there's a tragedy like what happened in Atlanta or what happened in Colorado. But in our case, in this case, it was people that were delivering food, picking up garbage, delivering the newspaper, all these things that we do, I think, as a society, take for granted.
We do. We take it for granted. And that's the other side of the tunnel, right? As we try to see a little bit of light right now, that these I cannot. We've already kind of recast what those dynamics are. We've already kind of found an example that you and I've talked about before. In my building at 30 Rock, 5% of the employees are in the building.
That's it,
right? And the organization evolved so that they could help all of their employees still keep the business going. And that ain't easy to do. It's for the welfare of the team, of the company. So I think we're going to see some new things. I don't know what they are, but we are going through potentially the idea of a new industrial revolution that is twisting. And I believe it's going to be a selfless space.
Okay. And toward that shift, you yourself had to deal with your father's illness.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big part of how this book came about.
Yeah.
Your father has Alzheimer's.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about what was going on with you. You were working. You're not an only child.
No, I'm number 3 of 4.
I found, oh, really? Okay. This will bring up, so that's interesting because there's always someone in the family when there's more than one child. That's kind of like the point person that ends up carrying a lot of the load. My brothers and sisters may argue, but I kind of was that when my parents were ill too. So your parents live in San Francisco, and you were here in New York.
Right.
So what happened?
I went back for our annual Christmas gathering for the Louis. And that's normally like, my dad comes from 13 children.
Oh my goodness.
And you can imagine, and they're not even, as people like to say, they're not even Catholic or Irish, right? They're neither of those two, but they're Asian. So this is what happens. And they have lots of kids. And so I would like ask my mom, can you give me like the map or the organizational chart every time we'd have these gatherings, like who's who.
The cousins and
Yeah.
oh my gosh. Right.
My dad grew up super poor because he had so many children. And so it's the story of the fish with one fish with a lot of gravy and a ton of rice. And they grew up close is my bottom line point. And so when his youngest sister came over to me at the Louis gathering for Christmas, and she said, Richard, your dad can't remember his siblings' names. And that's when we knew he should go in for a neurological checkup.
Oh my
And
God.
that was the beginning.
That
And
must have been a shock.
that was a shock, but not a shock at the same time because he was always a forgetful guy. But we didn't want to hear was Alzheimer's.
No, of course.
And so that led then to, as it accelerated, me wanting to be in California to help. But in our business of journalism, it's an 8-day-a-week job.
You better believe it.
Yvette Miley, my boss, was like, well, I was thinking she's going to say, nice, you're a great guy, Richard, but this is a big job. And I call you up so you can go and do these stories wherever they happen. And if you can't do that, then look, which I was ready to accept.
I was going to ask, so when you found out his diagnosis, your thought with regard to work was, I've got to cut back on work, or
Right.
Or you were practically ready to leave, ready to give up? It was your dream job.
It was, yeah. It was my dream job. And, which means it's not, you still had a lot of work to do. You still want to do, because if you know this, because our job's like, oh, you love it, but there's so much you want to do.
Right. And it's so all consuming.
Yes.
It really is.
It is, right. That sort of all or nothing, very intense. But yeah, I realized that because he had done it for me as a kid many times, like teaching me how to defend myself when I was getting bullied as a little Asian kid, when, I needed money and he lent me money so I could go to college because I was working at Mrs. Fields Cookies for 4 years out of high school.
Mrs. Fields.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. We'll get back to that later. Go on.
So there was just no way, Nancy, that I was not going to consider this in a strong way. And I just said I had to ask the question at least. And lo and behold, Yvette looks at me and goes, well, I'm a long distance caregiver too. And I am going to think about some ideas. She gets out her paper, starts to crib some stuff. Says, okay, well, let's get back in a week. A week later, we have a plan. A year later, when my father's starting to require more assistance, more help, he's wanting to get out of the house, forgetting things more often, and my mother can't keep up, then I pulled the trigger. And by golly, if that was not an organization operating in a selfless way to let me, live through this while still working Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Wow.
And so
wow.
I've been flying back and forth now for about 6 or 7 years. For a long time, about 2 or 3 times a month. And that trip, it is 10 hours door to door.
It's devastating. And I thought, well, if I take the red eye, then I'll be okay and I can work the next day. And it doesn't ever work that way, even when you have to work that day. You brought up a couple of interesting things. And this reminds me, according to your book, there's 53 million of us in this country who have acted as caregivers.
You and me have walked down a road together without even know, and the biggest road we've walked down together. That's if you think of right in your life, as we sit here 6 feet apart from each other.
And we really are 6 feet apart.
And this might as well be a mile or 10 miles in terms of a very intense part of our life. And the fact that 53 million of us are family caregivers with no training and no pay, and it is a full-time gig, as you know.
Emotional on top of everything else. I mean, you do need some training, but the emotional toll it takes on you to see your parents, who I'm sure you had that same feeling, are invincible, and to see them vulnerable that way, that must have been so difficult. What happens for someone who's working for an employer that's not as good and not as kind and compassionate and not as, to use your phrase, selfless as NBC? What kind of, how do they deal with something like that? Are there tools that you talk about that could help people like that?
The idea is, first of all, create an environment where you are selfless. And I think that when you create that environment, it attracts other people that are like you. So you and I, for instance, talking about our selfless big learning lesson in life, which is caring for our parents, right? That was for you, I bet. What am I doing? And there were probably mornings you got up or did not because you stayed up all night and you were like, wow, I really am doing this. I am doing this. And you didn't realize that you were being pushed and stretched to the most selfless
No.
place that you had ever been.
When you're in it, you're just in it.
No,
You're in it.
I didn't either. And it really was. So when I was sitting with the book agents, and I was like, well, what do we talk about in this thing? What do we, and they're saying, well, caregiving, it's an important part of America. It's an important part of all humanity, but it just doesn't resonate necessarily yet in terms of a thematic.
Mm-hmm.
And so we said, well, what is the very core of why we do it? And it's because we figure out how we need to be selfless. And that was not easy. I would stand on the subway platform at 3 a.m. in the morning on Mondays because I got off work at 11 p.m. I'd go home and nap, pack, and I'd be standing there on 72nd Street there in Central Park West in the subway platform, waiting for hopefully, the train that's going to come right on time. Otherwise, I missed it. And I couldn't take a cab because I was traveling so much that I had to save my shekels. I had to save money. There's no way I could have
Every dollar counts at that point.
That's right.
It does.
It's $75 in a cab. It's going to cost me $8 to $10 if I take the subway. But you really have time for yourself to think about why you're doing these things. And I got that every time I bring that story up, I got to tell Nancy, I can see that picture of me standing there with my roller bag and my backpack and just like, it's 3:30 in the morning.
Oh
I just finished work but it has given me so much.
I do. I feel you. I understand. Can you talk a little bit about the concept of selflessness?
Yeah.
I'll tell you why I am asking and what really intrigued me. In a lot of ways, we have been sort of told that it's not a selfish thing to do self-care. It's almost the reverse of what you're talking about. Yet I understand it, but it's a tricky thing, especially, and we can talk about gender roles too, with women bearing a lot of the brunt of care. One of the important things I always say to friends, one of the
You're bringing down the house.
I know. The Strand is feeling us. One of the important things that I've said to friends who've been in similar positions is you're taking care of your parent, you're taking care of someone who's sick, but you've got to carve out time for yourself.
Yeah.
Which is not selfish, but selflessness, that almost makes those kind of actions seem like, talk me through this.
Yeah. I mean, I totally get it. And I hope you try to challenge the idea more, because I did too, all the way through it. That's why we have so much science and so much research in the book. I wrote it to prove it to myself. And I'm always like, so why? Give me the research. Why do I believe that particular practice, that particular exercise would work? And so you'll find a lot of that in the book, a lot of research. We had a scientist that worked with me. We had a researcher that was part of the team as well, because I had to prove it to myself. I had to. Self-care is so important that we had we had one chapter that was just about being too selfless.
Being too selfless. Okay.
Too selfless.
Okay. So there is a balance issue.
Oh,
with that.
yeah.
Okay.
There is any extreme, as we know, not good.
Right.
In most cases. Unmitigated selflessness is a problem. Your health will go down. You will be unhappy. You will not sleep. All sorts. And there's a test in the book that you can score. You take it, you answer it, and you get a score from about 0 to 50 is roughly the range.
Right.
If you give too much, it's unmitigated selflessness is the term.
Okay.
And there's also a test on the flip side to see how selfless you are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to see what your starting point is as you try to work up your muscles, which is the sort of the mantra of the book. How do you work up your muscles? How do you do bite-sized things all the time?
Right.
And that's why we called it an self-help book. Because it is kind of like, you're trying to get better.
Self-help book. Oh, that's kind of groovy.
Yeah. And but I'm gonna, because I love the Strand, I'm gonna put this right here.
Oh, cool. Okay,
yep. There you go.
That's good.
Sabir, you liking that one?
Yeah. Can
All
we
right,
see
there
that?
you
All
go,
right.
all
That's great. What are some of those bite-sized things that people can do? Because I also think that even a concept
Yes,
like
yes,
selflessness, for not everybody, but
it
some people
is.
might be just like, oh, I can't, it's too much.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, I give so much. Is there a
yes,
difference between,
right,
is there a subtle difference between someone who might feel that they're giving
yes.
or generous and someone who's selfless?
Yeah. So we did a poll as
Okay.
part of the original research on this to ask, first of all, do you want to be selfless? Over 90% said yes.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Flip side is, what does it mean to you? And most of the answers, 70% plus, were saying, well, it's like as big as what Mother Teresa used to do or Desmond Tutu. And so we want to do it, but we think it's these big things.
Right. Unattainable things.
Right.
Yeah.
Like you had to start an orphanage. So Nancy, do you want to be selfless? Go start. No. So the way we approach it in the book is to say, what are the bite-sized things that you can do? So one example, to build up your muscle tone so that when the big thing happens, you're ready to do the big selfless thing. A lot like the healthcare workers that we saw during COVID. They would go into work for years in their profession as healthcare workers. When COVID came around, they're like, we're in. We are running towards the fire. And they did it naturally. And it's because they had the muscle tone.
Yeah.
They've been doing it for so what we try to do is copy and emulate their strength by giving everyday things. So I'll give you one example.
Okay.
There was a study out of Stanford that said if you have prejudice against somebody else because of their ethnicity, or let's say in our case, I don't like black shirts, you don't like gray jackets. Let's just simplify it that way.
But totally a lie because I
Right.
do love both. But anyway, black and
She
gray,
caught
I
me.
go to it all the time.
She
But
caught-
anyway,
she
in
caught me.
any case, yes, go ahead.
Is that after 3 lunches or 3 coffees or 3 gatherings like this, or we just hang out, or let's say we go to an event, that the measures of what might be prejudice, that which were up here, would go just above 0. And they had surveyed hundreds in this process, those of different ethnicities. And by golly, how much more simple can it be than when you and I decide to go get a lunch, that I would say, okay, hey, I don't typically hang out with, with book stacks, but I'm going to go hang with book stacks.
Mhm.
Or I don't normally hang out with that person from that part of town because they're on the other side of the tracks, but I'm going to do that.
So it's just getting people in the room together.
Yeah.
Something as simple as that. That's a little step that people can take.
What 2 things don't belong together belong together. So that is an amazing that proof in research, what's way above my pay grade. One other quick, easy one is use less I and me.
Oh, yes. You use a term called meist
Yes.
language, which I'd never heard.
Yeah.
So how does a person do that? Like, I think there was a thing that you said about how selflessness it make someone more attractive. It can
Yes.
do all these things. Of course,
Yes.
when I saw that, I said, can it help us lose weight? And I put in parenthesis, I said us, not me. But yeah, talk about that language.
Nancy always makes me laugh. That's why I love. We would work together at 30 Rock, and we just
it was always the great talk in the makeup room.
It wasn't a long time.
No,
but
there were fun things in the makeup room, and there was one time when I was in one of those remote studios, and you
Yes.
were in another remote studio, and in between the little shots, I was like, and you were like, But talk about that.
Yes.
Those words, the I, the me, the meist language.
So there's a language, and then there's a losing weight. I want to do the losing weight first because I love that one. The thing is that the unintended benefits of being selfless is you will live longer. You will be more attractive. This is according to the research.
Okay.
I'm not going to pull it out of the sky. We looked at the data that was out there, and we brought it into you will be happier. And I'll give you some information about the first 2. Living longer, there was a study that followed 55 plus that were volunteering for a number of years.
Okay.
And what they found is those who volunteered for a selfless notion lived 4 years longer than the average. Those who volunteered for a selfish reason, -2 years. They died earlier.
Really?
Yes. And therefore, as they were watching this group over a number of years, the data showed it does pay off to do things with a selfless notion.
So how can a person that might think that they're being selfless really work that muscle, like, to really be selfless? Because that's interesting. Someone who volunteers, but it's not exactly for the, I know people who are like that, who talk about it,
Yeah.
who pride themselves in it. And it's not that I don't think that they should talk about it, but you get the feeling that they're talking about it because they want everybody to know
Yeah.
how selfless they are.
Well, that's
So is that part of it?
that is part of it. Yeah. And I love that question, because the way to look at what might be selfless for ourselves is not a 1 or 0. It is always going to be partially selfish.
Mm.
Like this book is partially selfish. Us sitting here talking about this book that I wrote with 10 other people that are part of the team is a selfish notion. But I do believe that it is 51% selfless, at least, if not greater. And I'm not going to be perfect. I'm not going to be, amazing at being able to, because as you know in the book, I am not saying I know what I'm talking about. I am not saying
You're a work in progress.
I am seriously, and the first chapter is halftime for a reason, right? I don't know. I just thought I got to look back and see to make the next half okay. I just want to make it better. And what I am, though, is a journalist exploring the problem. This is what you and I do. We're exploring the problem, finding the solutions, looking at the data, and all I'm doing is sort of reporting, okay, here was what we found. And to answer your question about those who might be saying, look what I did, that's like above our pay grade. We don't know whether they're more selfish or selfless, and that's above our pay grade, right? It really is. But we do know in our hearts whether we're doing it more to give than more to receive. And
that's a good way of measuring. Yeah.
So don't like, go poke yourself in the eye because, oh, I think I'm getting something out of it.
That's
don't
not
do
a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. It's human is what I'm saying. But so long as we are trying to get down that road, one of the things, for instance, with the book, all of the author proceeds are going to be donated, for instance.
Which is amazing. That's a beautiful thing.
And that was in the discussions like, well, Richard, do you walk and the talk? And I was like, yes. Okay, let's do it. So it's going to Alzheimer's Association for my pops.
Right.
It's going to the Asian American Journalists Association. I'm an Asian American journalist.
Wonderful.
And on finally AARP, which has been a great partner for me as well as I've been going through this journey. And so there are ways, but to work through it and walk the talk. But it's okay if folks aren't just right on the nose, because I'm not. You're probably not either, but you're probably better along than I am.
That's a great point, because it can be looked at in a very black or white way.
Yes.
And the truth is that we all live in the gray zone more than any other zone.
That's
so
right.
It's level and degree,
right.
and it's step by step. I have to tell you, one of the things that really got me when I was going through all of your stuff is, and I just have to look at this note.
Yeah.
This is one of the few times that I've talked to an author who's described author, collaborator, and researcher. There are 3 pictures here, not just you, but you've got your collaborator and your researcher. And I looked at that and I thought, this is selfless. This is a bit of that too, because it's, it's your book. You could just take all the credit. You don't have to let people know that you worked with this team of people, and yet you did. Why did you make that choice?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
No, I'm serious.
No.
That's a really groovy thing.
So there were 10 people total as part of the team. And this kind of, first of all, I couldn't do it alone.
And that's an important aspect of I think of creativity that people don't realize is collaboration is a gift. It's,
is. And I learned so much from it. You're looking at Nancy French, who's in the press kit, Helene Kesabir, who was a scientist that worked with us, but there are 8 others. Well, we had 2 comedians. Something you will know.
Yes, I saw comedians and poets.
Yes, that's right, 2 poets. So there are 4 poems in the back of the book. I've never actually read them out loud, but I have their collaborations.
Right.
And we have a front cover, amazing illustrator.
Oh yes, that did all these beautiful techniques of the dots and what they represent. And
What do you think they mean?
Maybe they're just little notions of selflessness. I was thinking it could be little pieces of that whole journey.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
No, it is. Here, and for the folks that are watching, I just want to move it closer and you can tell us when they can see it. Is this okay? This how's it look? Can you see it, Sabir? Okay, so these dots here that you see is what Nancy was talking about. And the reason why I wanted to really make note of it is because we thought about this forever. The cover process is really something else, but it is about what makes us whole. And what makes us whole is a lot of things that we give in small ways and that we
Mm.
receive. And like a ripples in a pond, they start to grow over time. And so when we thought about this, it was really a notion of how we are, right? If you think about what makes you and what makes me, like Nancy's been so kind to sit here tonight at the Strand, and it's one of those things of her giving, and I don't take it lightly, and it makes me whole, right? And vice versa.
But and on the same token, by the same token that you asked me, I felt like the opportunity to talk to you about this book was a gift as someone who was a caregiver
Yeah.
and knows what that
Yeah.
is like.
Yeah.
I love talking to other people who have walked the walk
Yeah.
and not just talk the talk, which brings me back to your dad and the fact that he referred to you as his favorite daughter. So
Yeah,
can
he
you
did.
talk a little about that, please? And this also connects with the point I was making earlier about there being one person in the family who is kind of like the point person. And you were all the way on the East Coast. Now,
Yeah.
were your other siblings closer to where your parents were?
So
Not to diss them or throw shade, but yeah.
So we actually sort of have this. So if this were the baton, we pass it to one or the other.
Right.
We've all sort of taken leads at different
Sure.
times, and depending on where we're at in our lives and what we're ready to go and do, it's changed. And I'm just grateful that we're at odds on a lot of things today. It ain't perfect. Like right now, today, as we sit here talking about this, there's a lot of things we don't agree on. Some of us aren't talking to each other. That's just, but it's
family.
It's family. It's just happening. We're going to get through it. It's important to us. But the one thing that you know and I know is that, and 53 million other Americans, is that the selfless team is a team, and they take on, in most cases, they take on different roles. What are you good at, Nancy? What are you good at, Richard? What are you good at, Sabir? Right?
Mhm.
Everybody's going to be doing what's good for them.
Right.
And that's back to these little things that come and go. Like I might handle that dot, you handle that dot, okay? And then Sabir will handle that dot.
Mhm.
He's never had this many call outs, I bet you, during one of these things. He's just
But
like,
it's a team effort is the bottom line.
That's right.
Yeah.
that makes
Wow.
us whole. That makes
Mhm.
us whole. I wanted to finish with the attractiveness thing.
Oh, yes, yes.
And
So there's scientific studies that
Yes.
show that not only does it make you healthier, but so yeah, the attractiveness and the diet. No,
And-
okay. No, we can just talk about the attractiveness. I was kidding about that.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to that if we can. But the attractiveness is there's an archaeological study, and the group of college age students, about 30 or so, were asked to rank each other by how they looked. Give them a number. So there was one individual, and she came in at 3.5 at the beginning, and at the end she doubled to a 7, more or less. And that is because people were able to see her heart and her mind, and all of a sudden her attractiveness number went up. So when it comes to people, we do see people more than a physical
Yes.
interaction.
Yes.
We really do.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just her. I mean, she was an example of the entire study, that the scores went up based on how selfless that person was scoring. And so we thought we'd test it.
See, I love hearing that. I can't help but think again of the two major mass shootings that have been discussed, and also of the insurrection that happened on January 6th, where we saw so much hate, so much
Yeah.
anger. How can we try to channel that kind of anger into something that's positive, like being selfless? How do we make that turn?
I think the first part is to understand that is not the majority of people.
That's true.
That's the reality.
Yes.
That's the reality when we're looking at a shooter, when we're looking at what happened in the Capitol. That's a super small percentage of our country, but causing a lot of damage. Like what happened in Colorado and Atlanta and just about all the other mass shootings
Right.
that we've covered.
And the ones that aren't covered.
And the ones that aren't covered. There's one person that is so selfish. the epitome of selfishness. But there's around them are all these selfless heroes that every time I meet, I'm like, I don't want to talk about, but we have to talk about the killer, because we have to say why it's wrong. We do have to report who did it, but not gratuitously. Like, I'm very careful about naming the suspects, very careful about alluding to the picture, because that often is the reason why they're doing it, or partially.
I know. I have noticed a lot less focus on the name and the identity of the perpetrators,
That's right.
and more focus on the victims, and more focus on the moments of grace, even among these awful incidents where people are being selfless. It's helpful.
That's the way to see these things. And in the book, as you know, I bring up 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different stories like that really underline what I mean to say about how to see these sickening situations, which, with Newtown, Connecticut, and elementary school students being slaughtered. I mean, it was a time at 30 Rock where Lester Holt, who loved to death, awesome guy, number 1, number 2, a great journalist, number 3, the anchor for NBC Nightly News, who's set a lot of historical landmarks just by him sitting in that seat.
Absolutely.
Love the guy. He's the nicest person, always waves to you in the subway. You know who I'm talking about, and you know the character I'm talking about. And that, when we saw what happened that day, was when all of us as on-air folks were crying. And the parallel I would make to that is, it's because not the parallel, but the takeaway I'd have from that is, we are reaching a point where we just, as a country, are crying together when we see that. We don't want that. And the same is true when we were looking at, for me at least as a journalist, when I was in Ferguson, and then Baltimore, and then here in New York with Eric Garner, and then my first story as a cub report, one of my early stories, was Rodney King. And so,
oh my goodness.
So for me, when I was standing in those streets, and I was like, we have done nothing. Where have we been? We need to keep on working hard, because and I would interview the veterans, the leaders, right, that were out in the streets trying to show the new generation, yes, you must protest, and this is the right way to do it. And they inspired me. But at the same time, I knew they were doing it in a very painful manner, because they'd lived through
right
the old times for us, which are the 60s.
Yeah.
They lived the old times.
No, these things didn't come out of a vacuum. I mean, they're very painful. You have, though, you've told some incredibly tough stories, but you were just now saying that while you were doing that, they were also inspiring to you. They helped you. Was it the examples of selflessness, to get back to the idea of the book?
Yes.
Were those things that you saw that
Yes.
kept you going?
Yes. In Ferguson, Missouri, when Michael Brown was killed, and I stood in front of his house and exactly where he died, and I spoke to his grandfather and his family, and we just don't like those stories. There's very little goodness right there, because that's where life was lost. But when you would walk, half a mile away, and you go to Sam's Market, you have Muhammad, who is a store owner, who the first night and the second night and the third night got burnt. His store was burned down. It was absolutely pillaged. It was looted. And the next day, he's out there with his employees, and they're cleaning the place, and they reopen. And then that same night, fire and looting and breaking the windows down again and taking off the plywood. Third day, Muhammad's down there sweeping
Again.
and I go in there, Nancy, and I'm like, okay, I got to talk to this owner, whoever it is, because why are you open? And so Muhammad, who was maybe 40 something, said, there's a lot of values that are built into me, and there's my religion. I'm Muslim. There's my family. There's my upbringing, and I'm here for this community. And there are certain people that depend on me opening my doors. They depend on the 2 or 3 things I've left on my shelves.
Oh my goodness.
And I said, but what about your wife? She's got to be saying, Muhammad, would you please stay home? I mean,
and she would be fair to say that.
And he said, yeah, he laughed about it. I said, no, but I got to do this. Those are selfless people amongst these stories that we're out there reporting. And we could go on. And I share some of because they inspired me. They always do. There's Bradley, who was out there as a reporter in Ferguson. There's Tiffany Parada, who is in El Paso, Texas, in a car with a shooter, who really inspired me. That I could, there's Peter Wang, who was, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, who held open a gate. This is a teenager. JROTC wanted to go to West Point, and the shooter was coming down. You might remember that the assigned police officer, law enforcement officer, was not to be found.
Right.
But where was Peter, who was a teenager? He was out there holding the door open so other high school students could run by, because of the values that he was learning in JRTC of honor and of giving. And many escaped as he was helping them get away, but he caught one of the bullets. And that, and the story ends with West Point posthumously accepting him.
Oh my goodness.
How about that?
Oh my. I'm just thinking about that for a second. I'm going to go off the reservation a little bit. And I hope saying off the reservation, actually thinking of it, is not a bigoted statement. It just occurred to me. But I realized sitting here, I mean, I'm more of an opinion person than a journalist, but how important is it at this day and time for people of color to be the ones that are not only reporting the stories, but deciding, I think we have a voice in deciding which stories are told. And along with that, do you think that the events of last summer will make, and of last week, and of the bigger focus on people of color who are endangered in this country, do you think that there's a change in the wind, perhaps?
Number one, you and I are hopeful people, and we are.
What else can I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's the opposite, which is we're giving up.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not giving up. I know you're not.
No,
no, we're not.
I think it would be selfish to give up.
Yeah,
I do actually.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. I do believe that after COVID, we have relearned what family means in a big way. We've been at home. There's the difficulties, which we've talked about, which is, mental health, social health, and those will always be dynamics we should be concerned about. But one thing is the nuclear family and the people that we care about, our close circle, our inner 5, whatever it might be, our inner 10, have been really, those strong ties are so strong right now. And that was some of the values that brought our country and many countries to their strength. And so when it comes to having people of color out telling stories as journalists, when I move to that second part of the question, I do believe that when I think back to 5 or 6 years ago, having people of color in the field was really important. And, when or those who understood what it was like to be a person of color, but certainly people of color being out there was important for those watching and for our ability to tell stories. Look, you and I don't want to be in the field as, oh, there's a story about the African-American community. Nancy, you go. There's something about the Asian American. Richard, you go.
But at the same time,
yes,
we have sensibilities that can open doors for a communication with people.
That's correct.
That a white reporter might not get.
And I feel like when I was reporting in those stories that were, when I was thinking about the state of race, those years, which I thought was just, oh gosh, where are we? And I would go to those communities as another person of color. And there's a lot been said that between the African American and Asian American community, there are great rifts and crevices.
Yes.
And I would say that there are rifts and crevices with many communities. It is not a perfect, this is a stereotype. No community is perfectly, we get along. But there's probably more alike than there is difference. And when I would go to report on the pain that I saw in the African American community, it was for me too.
Mhm.
I'm American, and therefore I'm African American. And because you're American, you're also Asian American.
Damn straight.
It is all of us.
I know.
You got your yellow card.
Mhm.
I got my black card. Right.
That's
That's what we have to. That's the reality. And our white cards too. We have to
Mhm.
own all of it.
Mhm.
All of these things are us. And so people of color being able to tell the story is 80% important most of the time. And for the Asian hate crimes that we've seen and stop AAPI hate in that particular movement, do you know that the first civil rights experience for the Asian American community, there's one really major one. It's the killing of Vincent Chin in Detroit. He was beaten with a bat in the street,
I did read about. Yes.
and that's 1982. And at that time, the Asian American Journalists Association was 2 years old, and they had maybe 50 members at the time. 3 or 4 of them, Helen Zia came from California, Tihua Chang and Corky Lee came from New York. And they went there to tell the story of an Asian American man that was beaten in the street with a bat. When I saw the autopsy photos 25 years later, it didn't even look like a head. And the 2 assailants got away with 3 months probation and $3,000 fine. And this is a story that's not unique to the Asian American community. I know that. It was, however, unique to them because they'd never had an event that would bring them together like that.
Wow.
And since then, we've had opportunities to build on that. This is the moment where we now have 1,700 journalists that are members of the Asian American Journalists, 50 to 1,700.
That's fantastic.
So when we saw what's been happening in the last week, you are seeing amazing journalists, number one, but number two is I've watched the other Asian American Pacific Islander journalists out there. The ability for them to now tell the story not of just today, but of an ignored history of 200 years, they've done so well and so amazingly well. I see the lilt and the nuance in what they're saying, but it's also why we're seeing so much emotion behind it.
It's true. And by having that diversity among the Asian American Pacific Islander journalists,
Yes.
you help drive the narrative. Same thing with African Americans,
That's
that
right.
that we're not a monolith.
No.
That there are different ways that we look at these issues, which seems like it would be something that everybody would
Yeah.
understand, but they don't. They just don't. So, I have to ask you, how is your dad? What's his condition these days? And there's a specific reason why I want to know.
I would just say one, because you sparked one idea when your
Oh,
last
please,
comment.
please, sorry.
And I do want to answer that question, is that journalism within itself is a selfless profession in its practice, theoretically, in that we are always telling the story of others. And we're trying to bring out the stories of what needs to be told in the world. And that, I think, is pretty neat. And only in thinking about what we've been through and finding the similarities of what the Asian American Pacific Islander community is going through, as well as the African American community has been going through, is once you're able to do that, right, and you're able to think outside yourself, that's when you're a good journalist. And that is a really interesting overlap, because if you are not good at that, then it hinders your ability in some cases. My dad gained a pound.
Oh.
And he's a real fatso. He is 139 now. This guy's big now, but
oh my goodness.
no, but you know what I mean, because with Alzheimer's, he's 8 years in. If he can maintain weight, we're good.
I understand. I totally understand.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to ask you before we go to some questions that we've gotten is, you wrote a letter to your father.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly in the timeline when that was, but was it something that you hoped he understood? Was it more important for you to write it for yourself? How did he receive it? And did that even matter? That's like a 5-part question. Sorry.
Yeah. My dad doesn't understand a lot right now. But we did do something that really taught me a lot about the way humans work. And, just like when we would take our father to hospital, he's been there probably 15 times in the last 2 years. And there's one thing we all know in my family is we know that patient, we know that man inside and out. We can tell you why he's breathing fast, why his heart rate's up and why it's down. And so I took a mic one time and I put the amplifying headphones over him. I said, Dad, are you there? Can you hear me? If so, because he can't talk, blink once. And he looks up at me and he does. And I was like, Nancy, what? All right, that can't be real. So I take out my camera. I'm like, okay, I got to record this because maybe I just want to see what I'm seeing. So then I go, okay, hey, Dad, this is Richard, your son. If you can hear me and you blink once.
Oh my goodness.
Hoo-wee. And I got it. So, gratitude. And in that letter, he keeps on giving me stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And what
he's there. He's there. He's there.
Yeah. And so that's another little thing that he's giving and that he's listening.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, we have some questions.
Yes. So sorry to interrupt, but we do have a few audience questions.
All right.
Go Sabir.
Our first one is from Susie Smith, who says, Richard, you've had a career with a lot of change. How has that helped adapt to this changing role?
That's a good question.
Yeah. It changed my career. It's given me more eyes, I guess, to see the world, really. And when it comes down to, and I talked about the 3 lunches, right, with different people. So I get to talk to a lot of different people, and I'm used to talking to a lot of people, and I enjoy it. And if there's one thing that's different for me now is that I feel like I can, my empathy muscle has gotten so strong now because journalists, that's what we do. I did not get into the business, Susie, to do that. It's helped me with taking care of my father because I see things that I don't think I would have seen otherwise. And I think I'm more understanding and accepting and more vulnerable as well. Because when you get to know other people and you really do that every day, it is I've gone through caregiving too, Nancy. And when I say that now is totally different than I would have said it 10 years ago.
Oh man.
Like I've gone through it with you too, Nancy. And I have. And the way I can say that now, and it's not because it's just there now. And sometimes, Susie, I can't keep my emotion, whether it's happiness or sadness, away. It doesn't, but that's okay. That's okay. And so it has helped me be a better caregiver.
Right. And then our next question is for both you, Nancy, and Richard. It's from Patricia McMillan, who this question was in response to the section of your conversation where you were discussing the news's fascination with covering events on the street. And she said, if reporters don't like stories, why are they still assigned? Do sponsors benefit from TV showing more carnage on the streets?
Wow, that's deep. Patricia, that's who asked that. Well,
You first.
I'm I'm not a journalist. I was hired by CBS to give opinions, which I'm grateful for because I don't know if I could just tell stories without getting my opinion in there. And that really is not the job of a journalist. You do a brilliant job at the work that you do. You always let the stories lead. One of the things that I had heard though in classes that I took and whatnot is the adage, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
And that's why a lot of news seems to be driven by things that are graphic, violent, and so on. I will say this, and you tell me if you've noticed the same thing. It does feel like because things over the last 4 years were so grim in so many ways and continue to get more grim. And then this last year and this pandemic has just been devastating. I have started to see a bit of a balance on almost every newscast of something that's kind, a story of selflessness, a story of someone making someone's life better, happier, which is gratifying.
Yeah.
And I think for the viewers, you can breathe,
Yeah.
because it's been like this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What's your experience been? So I mean, I think that there's a shift.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a really good question, right? And there's a shift of compassion and empathy, and it's because we are living through a tough time. And I think, Patricia, your question, which is a good one, and just to open up the factory doors a little here, and that is, I thought I had something that was on my sleeve there. Sorry, is that it is typically that journalists will get assigned about 90 to 95% of our stories, and that's our job. Right. Assigned meaning we have an editorial meeting with like 10 people in a room, and we decide what's good for the day and what is newsworthy in order. This is for news shows like the nightly news programs that you see on ABC, CBS, and NBC and PBS. Sit there, and this is all news focused. And about 5 to 10% of the stories are enterprise stories where I will pitch up, and let's say that Nancy's my executive producer. I'll say, hey, Nancy, I got this story in Seattle where I don't think it's being told. There is an issue of what's called yellowface. What's yellowface? Well, have you heard of blackface? Well, if you know blackface and you know yellowface, and that's when you have actors that are not of that ethnic background, and it goes back to Al Jolson. And I'm giving you a real example, and I do talk about these sorts of items where I am enterprise pitching stories in the book. And the reason why I do it is because if you see the fire, you better say, hey, there's smoke over there, let's go. And
where you will spot smoke in places that other people wouldn't spot that smoke.
That's correct.
Right.
I saw that smoke, and I knew immediately that the Mikado, which was a play where you had mostly white theater actors, and there's nothing wrong with that within itself. It's just that it was a story about Japanese, and there's certainly Seattle's the birthplace of JACL, which is the oldest Asian American civil rights group founded by Japanese. That's Seattle, and so you can certainly find. And so I went out. That's one of my enterprise stories I went out there to do, and so that's the mix generally. Does it profit them when they assign the stories? These are all for-profit organizations. This is above my pay grade. Only to say that as a journalist and all of us gathering, we focus on what's good for news. And 80% of the time we get it done. And that's got to be satisfying.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because the other thing I'll add to that is that it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago that it suddenly dawned on me that TV, I'm not talking about social media as much, although it's going that way, but TV is more about the advertisers, the news shows, and even a show like CBS Sunday Morning. We're the filler. We're the filler. It's all about ad revenue. So that there are times that the filler is actually educating and illuminating people and telling great stories is a bonus. But that's really kind of what I know. It was a very devastating day when it dawned on me, and I was like, oh.
Well, I got to tell you, Nancy and Sabir, I like what her show does because it's just great. It's more than filler.
Well, thank you. And in our case, we are able to pitch things more than Richard's, because it's driven by a lot of that finding the smoke. But still, you do beautiful work, and we're good filler. We're very important filler. Don't tell anybody I said filler. Okay.
So we only have time for one last question.
You can ask two if you want. We'll answer both.
Okay. Well, so
that's telling them.
Good. Our first one is from Matthew then, who says, when we think about selflessness versus selfishness, should we not worry or think about whether others are being selfish or selfless? And then the second question is from Rabia, who asks, during an age of, quote, cancel culture, how do we go about offering grace to those who come from a place of ignorance and not from a place of hate?
Yeah.
So, two different polls, but
I like
great questions.
Yeah, I like that last one, how it was approached, because one of the things I keep forgetting to use my mic, and I keep pulling up a sock because I realize that there's I'm so tall that my pants are too short. And anyway, I just had to say, you were honest about thinking something was on your sleeve. I want to, my thing about that phrase cancel culture is I hear that and I think the culture that we're trying to cancel is selfish, bigoted, unkind behavior. That's how I see it, because I've heard it used in a certain way. And I think, I don't know that that's really, it's canceling crappy culture. Boy, I held myself back. I was going to say something else. But yes, that is a tricky balance. And I think one of the things we didn't get to in this conversation has to do with social media and Twitter and being selfless in ways on those platforms. So maybe what do you think about having grace? And I know we're focusing on the second question first, but how does a person have more grace, let's say, on social media and become more selfless? Maybe that will help toward understanding cancel culture, being more forgiving about things that people say.
First of all, I'd find out whether the statement and or idea and or belief and or concept is real.
Huh.
Is it real?
Before that's difficult, right?
No,
it shouldn't be, but people think that real means a couple of different things these days.
Well, real is going to places like this, is going online to established sources of information. There's difference between news and facts versus opinion, as you understand, and go to the places. Like I always ask the question, how long does it take you to buy a new pair of shoes, right? And most folks will say, a week. I'll look online, I'll sit on it for a while. Or how long does it take for you to buy a new phone? And that could be 2 weeks because you're thinking through it. Well, how long does it take for us to decide whether a trusted source is a trusted source before we pass it on? Well, what you might do, because let's say we buy a phone every 2 years or every year, whatever the case may be, or a new pair of shoes about once every year or every 6 months, do the same about what are your trusted sources of information. And so when you see an idea that's out there, if it is absolutely now, after thinking about it, worth canceling, then yeah, I would say that's not for me. Mm-hmm. I'm away from that. Mm-hmm. It's basically saying I believe in its heart that sort of concept of cancel culture is it's time to just say no. It's time to say this is the way it is. We're done. It's a lot like for the Asian American Pacific Islander community. We're done being your model minority.
Yes.
We're done being your model minority.
Because that it makes you not human. It makes it takes away your individuality, your wholeness.
It's not only wrong. What does it mean? It means there's a good minority and a bad minority. Mm. All right, that's a whole other conversation. You and I,
we'll have
Severe, we'll regather on the other corner.
For enough about us is going to be the next one. Enough about Richard and Nancy. But anyway, yes, no, that's an excellent point. That's such a good point.
So I think the grace is in the details and in taking a breath. Like for me, whenever I react or whenever I write a post, is a long discussion with a team about what I'm going to. Before was me just sitting there, okay, did I get that right? What about the preposition? What about that? But I would do everything, and now it's a team. We'll go, okay, is that the right thing to say? But everything is my words in the end. So I think those are two ways that I'd approach it. And in terms of looking outside, I'm selfless, but if others aren't, do I still do it?
That's right. That was the first question. Good.
Yeah, and okay. I have lived because I grew up with that very same dynamic where, well, I'm doing it this way and they're not doing it that way. Why am I going to do it that way? Okay, so if they're not doing it that way and I'm doing it this way, so why should I do it this way? I'm going to do the way that they're doing it. And I quickly moved into a space where they may not get it right, but they may have the right intention. They may not get it as 100%. They may not get the A for being that way.
Right.
But if they are getting a C minus, they're getting that 51%. I got to try to see that. And I need to, for myself, do what I think is right. And I'm also not going to be so good at it either. So to Matthew, that's what I would say is, I don't have the perfect answer, only that I try to do things and I'm super imperfect about it. And for the others, I try to look a little bit deeper in terms of who they are and to understand if they're 51%, and their heart's in the right place, then yes, that's okay. I get it. I totally get it. So those are two really deep questions from Matthew and Radia at the end, or Radia.
And he remembers names and which is, I think, wonderful. That's a thing that one can do towards selflessness.
You know, Elizabeth, I've been saying this for a long time. You're right. Elizabeth is the best here.
Richard Lui, enough about me. The Unexpected Power of Selflessness. I wish you so much luck with this book. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah,
we have so much more we could talk about, and we'll be in negotiations about the next book that we'll be doing together.
Enough about us.
Enough about us.
And thank you all for being here too. Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, and
thank
Samir.
you to the Strand and Samir. Thank you so much.
Yeah.